There we go. Okay. I think my headphones are working. What do we got for volume? I think I want to, yeah, about centered. So each of these episodes is about 8 minutes. Of course, I'm going to be pausing it to talk about things that I find interesting here. I don't know how much commentary I'm going to be able to bring here. Early Christian schisms. A schism is like, I believe in this context, a division. So there have been divisions since forever. Uh, Protestants and Catholics. There we go. We've talked about some divisions earlier, like in the first video that we checked out today. So yeah, divisions have existed within Christianity since the early times. So that's probably a really interesting conversation. I don't know if this is like a compilation of different schisms or just like the first schisms. We'll only be able to find out once we've experienced such. So, yeah, let's get this one started. The first episode is called Before Imperium, and this is one of four, and we will be doing all of them today if all goes well. We shall see. Let's get this one started.
We're going to start this off in a way that we've never started off an extra history before, with a disclaimer. These next
Cool.
few episodes are designed to help modern students get a handle on one of the most confusing and yet most important parts of Roman history. The topics discussed in these episodes are vital to understanding the Roman mind, to understanding why Rome fell, and how the Western world made the transition from the classical era to the medieval one. We're going to try to make this as engaging as we can, but it is going to involve a lot of nitty-gritty detail about doctrinal disputes.
Yes. That sounds wonderful. I don't know how much it's going to work in a reaction, but that sounds very enticing to me. All right.
To a modern mind, these disputes may seem inconsequential, but they tore empires apart and turned father against son back in the waning days of Rome. Even in our episodes about Justinian, we found that the lack of ability to easily reference things like the monophysite schism or the difference between Arian Christianity and Orthodox Christianity impacted how thoroughly we could tell the story. So hopefully we can rectify that today. So let's dive into the docetic schism, Judaizing Christianity, and Gnosticism.
Sick. So, Christian divisions. I don't really get into the nitty-gritty of that all too much in my studies. There's very specific groups and very specific divisions that I get into. I study the Puritans a decent amount. I very often get into like the Quakers and their own, all these little Christian factions, and that often ends up with a discussion on division. But there's so many different Christian divisions that it's hard to really keep them all straight sometimes. The early stuff I feel like is going to be about as far out of my comfort zone as possible. So that'll be different for the channel. It's not something I visit often, so this should be cool.
Before we can discuss the struggles that changed empires, we have to discuss the struggles that determined what form of Christianity the Empire of Rome would come to accept. And for that, our story begins on the baked plains of Asia Minor. It's difficult sometimes for us in the present day to think of Christianity as something not yet solidified. It's hard to imagine it without the New Testament. It's harder still to think of it not as a religion of its own, but rather an offshoot of Judaism. And yet out here on the plains of Asia Minor in the 1st and 2nd century CE, that's the issue that many early Christians wrestled with. I mean, were they still Jewish? Could only Jews be Christians? Did Christ overthrow the Mosaic Law, or was he simply a continuation of it? And on the answer to this question hangs everything. Why? Circumcision. I know, it's funny, but the fate of Western society really did hang on circumcision. Because, you see, the Judaizing Christians, the Christians who wanted to follow the Mosaic laws strictly, wanted everybody to be circumcised. And in an age before anesthetic, when you're asking grown men to have their foreskin cut off as the entry fee for joining your religion, you're just not gonna get as many takers. And this is why Paul rails against circumcision in the book of Galatians. He, like many of those we now consider church fathers, knew that for the religion to really grow, for it to really be a force, they would have to convert the Gentiles, the people.
I believe Paul was so influential because he was like I don't know what he would have been considered at the time, like kind of noble. He was well off. He was like an upper class type gentleman type individual, literate, could really communicate things in a way that that the upper class could accept and stuff. So he could bring them into like a more sophisticated groups of discussion and sort of stuff. So it makes sense why Paul would be a very good example for understanding how to expand the religion. If it means pulling back on the traditions, then it comes off as like kind of cynical, like trying to expand the religion at the expense of the content of the religion. That's what it just seems like from a distance. I'm personally not all that religious, and I don't mean to insult anyone. This is more just like kind of an outsider viewing this, independent of like modern people who practice religion. Like if I were to see like anybody doing this in like say just a purely political movement, I would probably say about the same thing.
Of the Roman Empire, and the only way to do that was to abandon some of the Jewish practices those people would find the hardest to accept. And as this viewpoint won over more practitioners, the Judaizing forces began to be squeezed out of what we consider mainstream Christianity, eventually leading to further attempts to distance the two religions, like declaring Sunday as a holy day instead of Saturday. But for us, the important part is that without the fateful decision to break from Jewish tradition, a decision which split the church and whose consequences in terms of fracturing the early Christian community are written into the Bible itself, without that decision, Rome probably would never have become a Christian state, changing history forever. But even as the Judaizing forces were waning, there was another question that tore early Christian society in two. This question was on the nature of Christ. Was he a man?
Oh yeah.
Was he a spirit? What was his relationship to God?
The Holy Trinity, there we go. Okay. Yeah, this still differs depending on what sect you're a part of. Are they all different things? Are they one thing?
And this would turn into one of those knockdown, drag-out questions, with bishops calling other Christians antichrists and worse than pagans because of their views on it. In fact, this question is going to come up over and over and over again in this series, because this question, which eventually morphs into questions about the Trinity, sits at the root of so many conflicts in the Church. But let's start here, in the early 2nd century, still in the plains of Asia Minor. A bishop called Ignatius is arrested. He's going to be taken to Rome, sentenced to die in the Colosseum for his faith. But along the road to Rome, he writes to his followers, time and again, with a warning. Not a warning against the Romans. He seems almost eager to meet his fate. No, a warning against other Christians. Christians who do not see Christ the way he does. Christians that inhabit his very city, Antioch. Docetists. Docetists believed that Christ was a being of pure spirit, that he didn't actually exist in human form, that he only seemed to us to exist. For, after all, didn't it denigrate the Christ to claim that he'd ever been part of our sinful race? But that sat very, very poor.
That's a different one. I've not necessarily heard that argument before. Oh, that's really interesting. So he would have manifested to us in something that to us seemed to be human, but he never quite was. I'm trying to think of all the things that might screw up when you think about the story as it is now, but yeah, they don't necessarily have like the story completely locked down at this point. So it doesn't necessarily have to contradict everything because it's not set in stone yet.
Poorly with some other Christians. If you've ever wondered why John in the epistles continuously talks about the importance of believing in Christ, quote, in the flesh, if you've wondered why that phrase comes up over and over again, it's actually a dig at these guys. When he says, every spirit that confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God, and this is that spirit of Antichrist. Reading that today, it might seem like he's aiming that condemnation at pagans or non-Christians, but he's actually taking a shot at the Docetists. Why? Because what happens when you make Christ a being of pure spirit? What becomes of his sacrifice? A spirit can't suffer. Without that, where's the pathos? Where's the actual sacrifice of his death? And what becomes of the resurrection? A spirit can't die, so what does it mean for it to be resurrected? Can our sins even be forgiven without sacrifice? Can we be reborn if the Christ was not? And these were all important questions in a time of persecution and death. When simply being known as a Christian might mean execution, you needed something to hold on to. Which brings us back to Ignatius and what's going on in Rome. As Ignatius was off to do his last dance with the lions, he was thinking a lot about martyrdom, and he wrote to his followers about how glad he was to truly follow Christ, even in this. And martyrdom was a powerful symbol. It gave strength to the community to endure persecution, and it impressed those not yet of the faith. It helped to win over Romans, and became an ingrained part of the understanding of Christianity. But to have the symbolic power of martyrdom, and the very relatable, very sympathetic, very human sacrifice of Christ, the Christian church had to purge itself of yet another group of people who called themselves Christians, the docetists, and eventually reinforce these ideas with things like transubstantiation, the consumption of the body and the blood of Christ in communion. But with this culling of...
Oh yeah, that would totally screw up all of that, because there would be no body. That's so strange to me. These guys are kind of a game changer in like the early stuff. This really does make me rethink a lot of the early stuff, because like it didn't have to be the way that it is. Whatever, those of you who are Christians, whatever you happen to believe, it is what it is. But I find it so interesting how it could have been. Because a lot of us, those of us who are religious or whatever, we get it so much from our geography in a lot of ways, from the circumstances of our birth. You're not really going to be, you're not as likely to be a Christian if you're born in like a predominantly Hindu country, a predominantly Muslim country, a predominantly insert religion here. So despite what people might believe now, they would very likely believe something completely different if this had gone a different way. I love like the alternate universe stuff. We should do some alternate history stuff next week. Maybe I should do that. If any of you want to hop on the Discord and give me some cool alternate history stuff in the reaction channel, let me know, because that might actually be a really cool direction to go here.
Of the church, the stage is now set. With the inclusion of the Gentiles and the rejection of a doctrine which sees Jesus as pure spirit, Christianity is set to grow. As imperial order falls apart during the 3rd century crisis, and the state can no longer provide food for the poor or care for the sick, the church steps in. Converts from all walks of life, but especially the impoverished, begin to join the faith. These do seem like the end times of which the Christians preach. To many in the empire, it seemed like a time of divine reckoning for humanity's sins. But then, as the 3rd century begins to close, order is restored to the world. Aurelian puts the pieces of the empire back together, and Diocletian and Maximian solidify those gains. And with this restabilizing of the empire come some of the harshest crackdowns on the Christian faith. But then the miraculous, or highly calculated, happened. In 312 CE, a civil war rocks the empire. At the deciding battle, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, one of the leaders, Constantine, had a vision. It told him to have his men paint the letters Chi Rho, the first 2 letters in Greek of the word Christ, on their shields, and if this was done, he would conquer. It was done, and he won the day and became master of the Roman Empire. Now, whether you buy the vision story whole hog or accept some of it as a later bit of revisionism that's come down to us is up to you, but what we do know for certain is that after...
Yeah, that's one thing that I find so difficult about like ancient history. The lack of sources. Like, there's only so much you can do with something like that. You have to like kind of make an educated guess to the best of your ability to discern what sources are good. You can compare them to others, you can do your best, but in a lot of ways it all dries up a little faster than sources closer to modern day. But I also don't like doing history that's a little too recent, because then there's the problem of too much information. I kind of like it to be like a healthy middle in a lot of ways. I think having like somewhere kind of in the middle where it's kind of challenging. Sometimes you'll be missing stuff, and there is kind of an adventure to trying to figure that stuff out. But in places where it's like there's just too much sourcing, oh god, it's kind of a pain. And I think your preference on that will often determine what you end up studying if you end up going into history. To what kind of sources do you want to work with, and like how much do you want to be given? Because you're only going to have so much in certain time periods. And some people really enjoy working with a lot of that stuff. It takes a special kind of mind for every single period, and everybody has something that appeals to them. This doesn't work for me, but I like learning about it from people who do like it.
After this battle, Constantine began to repeal the laws banning Christians, and even began to support them. This was a sea change, even with its rapid growth during...
Yeah, Alternate History Hub is probably the way to go. If anybody has a specific video they want me to check out from him, let me know, because I love the guy. He's hilarious. He's one of my favorite people to follow on Twitter. So, like, if anybody has anything specific they like from him, let me know, because it's really cool, and there's so many options.
During the turbulent years of the 3rd century, Christians only comprised 10% of the Roman Empire. Within 40 years, they would make up over half of it. But before that, there's a rocky road ahead. Join us next time as we finally get to the heresies that shook the empire. Oh, and for those of you who know the history here and are wondering about some of the things I've not mentioned, expect James to talk more about Constantine's faith in the Lies episode after we're done. See you next time.
And I still don't really do the Lies episodes on here. Like, I like to leave those to kind of just watch in my free time. It feels like they're more for just me kind of sitting around and watch. I don't know. Maybe I'll end up doing Lies episodes at some point in the future. I just don't really feel like doing them on video as much. Though they can be enlightening. I really do enjoy them, the ones that I have seen. All right. So since I have this all in one big playlist, I can just jump to the next video. Very cool. So 1 out of 4 here. So we're going to continue this. I'm just checking the chat to make sure I'm actually up to date here. I am not up to date. My little stream thing here is a little behind. Okay, I think I'm kind of up to date with things. Alright, let's continue. This is so far really cool.
Last time we talked about a few of the doctrinal disputes that tore the early church apart, even while they were being persecuted from the outside by the emperors in Rome. Disputes that to them seemed so important that they were often a bigger concern than getting thrown to the lions for their faith. Disputes that have been passed down to us for 2,000 years because they were so important to the early church that they made their way into the Bible. But the outside pressures on Christianity are about to end. Constantine is busy repealing the laws against Christians, and in 313, with the Edict of Milan, he restores essentially full rights to Christians within his empire. But this itself brings up another tricky problem. What do you do with those who had buckled under the pressure of the persecution? Those who had recanted or turned their back on the faith when threatened with imprisonment or death? What do you do with the fact that so many of those who had been asked to turn over the scriptures or to sacrifice to pagan gods were not merely converts to the religion, but even priests? Can you let them take an equal footing with those who had stood firm? Can you let those who had wavered in their faith administer the faith? And again, this question split the church. In North Africa, a bishop named Cecilian was elected the Bishop of Carthage, but he was a traditor, or one of those who had handed over Christian scriptures when threatened with persecution, and so his election was contested. In general, most of the Christian population was alright with accepting back into the fold those who had lapsed during a time of greatest trial, but especially in North Africa, there was a group that was far less forgiving. They viewed any sacraments given by such a bishop invalid, and so soon elected their own bishop, Donatus, and refused to acknowledge the authority of Cecilian, the bishop recognized by the church in Rome. As letters flew back and forth and sermons were given, Donatus decided to do an end run around those who were trying to unseat him and sent a letter to the emperor directly, asking him to weigh in. This was basically unheard of. The church settled church matters, the emperor settled matters of state, but here it was, and Constantine agreed to step in. Now this sets a precedent for hundreds of years of emperors, if not directly commending the church, at least having a great deal of sway over church matters. It effectively broke down...
Oh, here we go. We're getting like the beginning of this. This is like this would have been great to like bookend this stream with and have it be like the thing at the end, but we're gonna be watching dinosaurs after this. But this actually like it takes us back even earlier than a lot of the issues from the first video we watched today for the oversimplified video. That's actually wonderful. I don't plan on these always having a lot of thematic similarities between them. The only ones that I planned were the Houdini one and the Arthur Conan Doyle stuff. But like, I like when there's parallels, especially when the material is so far apart chronologically.
On the barrier between church and state. But at that time, no one knew that, and that's certainly not what Donatus was thinking about. He was probably just trying to figure out how to get a fair shake when, right then, the only people who were allowed to judge his case were the very people he had essentially rebelled against, and the emperor was willing to grant him that. Constantine designated that a hearing be set with the Bishop of Rome and 3 other bishops from Gaul that he would pick personally to make sure that they had no stake in the matter. Then he went off to do other imperial things. But when the Donatists' case came up, the Bishop of Rome had ninja'd in an additional 15 bishops that just so happened to agree with him. So, as you can probably guess, the trial didn't go so well for Donatus and his Donatists. In fact, it went so poorly that not only was their case thrown out, but their supporters were branded as heretical. So, of course, geez. Donatus was pretty miffed, and wrote the emperor again, saying, hey, look, there were about 12 more guys in that committee than you appointed. Can we, get another fairer hearing, maybe? So Constantine, interested in bringing the church back together, said, yeah, sure, and this time I'm just gonna call a bunch of bishops from all over and have them hear you out so that way it can't be unfair. And so that's what he did. The Donatists again made their case, and again their case was rejected. This time too, their views were branded as heretical, largely, as I understand it, because it calls into question the sacrament of penance if there's something, even something as momentous as turning your back on the religion, that you can't atone for. So the Donatists went back to Africa and sent Constantine a 3rd letter, but by this point he had just about had it. He was actually hanging out at the trial this time, and he'd felt like they'd gotten a fair shake. What do you guys want? Meanwhile, conflict between the 2 viewpoints had begun to escalate to violence in North Africa, and that was it. Constantine basically said, don't make me come down there, and threatened to crush them all under his sandal. But then he got distracted by an itty-bitty civil war, and had no time for this ridiculousness. So
we are a long way from having a wall of separation between church and state, aren't we? That is actually something I wanted to mention earlier in the stream. I had so many things I wanted to talk about, but I get so caught up in it and I end up forgetting most of it. One of the big video projects that I have right now, a huge thing, kind of in the style of my first YouTube short, the one I did on Benjamin Lay. I'm trying to work on a slightly bigger project in that fashion, kind of an original history video, kind of centered around my home state, and the conversation is going to be largely around some of the origins of the separation of church and state in the United States. And this is in it's in the 1600s, and they're still fighting over this, and they're still going to be fighting over it for like generations. I don't even know if we've perfectly separated church and state in a lot of ways. So there's nothing abnormal about this, and nothing hopeful really coming from me when it comes to like having a tolerant civilization where we can all just coexist, hold hands, and kiss.
So the Donatists essentially became a major splintered church in North Africa that would be a thorn in the side of the empire for years to come. And in the countryside, it would survive right through Justinian's reconquest of North Africa centuries later. In fact, the Donatists would later harbor anti-Roman rebels, and some scholars have even argued that the disunity they caused weakened the province and essentially made it indefensible during the Arab conquests. So there's one crack in the unity of the empire and the church that doesn't ever go away. Now it's time to talk about the next, even bigger one, Arianism. Because just as the Donatist question was...
Okay, I need to learn more about the origins of this, because this is a much bigger conversation here, a much more popular conversation. I don't fully understand the origins of Arianism. That is a very... I assume we're talking about like the same like Aryans that we'd be talking about like when we talk about like Nazis and stuff. I don't know. Maybe this is a different Arianism. I think this might have like origins and that are similar to that. I could be wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong, please, because I have no idea. But this is definitely something I want to know.
Was flaring up in Carthage, another schism was beginning to spin out of control in Alexandria, where a bishop named Arius was preaching a brand new understanding of the Trinity. Which means I'm going to now try and define the Trinity on the internet. Okay, so it's time for disclaimer 2.
Lovely.
We are not theologians. What I'm offering here on any of this is meant as a serviceable understanding for people interested in exploring the history that's so intimately wrapped up in these things. But there is a lot more depth that could be gone into here, and the exact definition, well, that...
Okay, Light Giver's saying it's a different Arianism. Okay, good. I can learn about the other things separately, because that's confusing when it's the same word we're talking about. I know that we'd be getting into like German history and stuff when it comes to that. I know they have some stuff that like goes back, some stuff that like claims to be kind of like a sequel to the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman and all that stuff. So I was thinking like, could that have passed down that long? Maybe. Okay, there we go.
Could be debated for 2,000 years, and it has. So that said, what is the idea of the Trinity? It's the concept that God is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost all rolled into one. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, in the loosest form, it's the idea that God the Father is in heaven, God the Spirit acts upon the world, and God the Son is the Christ who came down in human form to wash away humanity's sins. Now that part seems simple enough, but there's one more part to it, the part that everybody fought about. In Trinitarian belief, God is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but the Father is not the Son, nor the Holy Spirit. The Son is not the Father, nor the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is neither the Father nor the Son.
Hard.
Confused yet? That's okay. It's one of the most difficult concepts in the entire Christian faith, and it's something that has caused more debate and infighting than almost anything else. But hopefully that brings everybody up to speed enough so that we can talk about this radical new idea that Arius was preaching. What was it? Well, he was preaching that because God the Father begat God the Son, while they were both still divine, God the Son was less than God the Father. They weren't co-equal and co-substantial in the way that the Trinitarian formation laid out. Now, this may not seem like a big deal to you, and fair enough. Truth is, the local bishop in Alexandria seemed to see it the same way. At first, he didn't do anything about this fractious doctrine. But soon it became clear that this wasn't just going away. The congregation was divided. Arguments were breaking out in meetings of the faithful. It was time to step in. The bishop in Alexandria called a synod, and they decided that this Arian doctrine was heresy. Arius was stripped of his priesthood, and he and his followers were excommunicated from the church. But it was too little too late. This idea had already spread throughout the Eastern Empire. This became a grueling feud that threatened to tear the church in two. Now,
so one could possibly argue that they could have nipped this in the bud, like, early on. And by just ignoring it, it may have exasperated the problem. I mean, it's possible that they would try to, like, solve the question early on, and then it causes an earlier fracture with those who do not see it the same way. But it seems like early on, there was potential to kind of, get rid of it. And maybe people wouldn't have thought nearly as much about it.
Constantine was trying, for a number of reasons, to basically hand these Christians the keys to being the #1 religion in the #1 empire in the known world, and here they were squabbling worse than pagan cults. Constantine was irked by this.
Really
so he sent down a cleric that he trusted to settle the matter and armed him with a letter that ends thusly. Open then for me henceforward, by your unity of judgment, that road to the regions of the east which your dissensions have closed against me. And permit me speedily to see yourselves and all other peoples rejoicing together, and render due acknowledgment to God in the language of praise and thanksgiving for the restoration of general concord and liberty to all. Basically, he was saying, guys, for serious, just stop fighting, let me get back to emperor stuff, please. But it just so happened that the cleric he sent down was a strident Trinitarian, so instead of finding a resolution and bringing everybody back together like Constantine had asked, the cleric decided that smashing the Arians in the face was a better idea, and he succeeded in basically causing a bunch of riots and not much else. So the cleric called a council to settle the matter once and for all, one where, at least theoretically, the Arians would be heard out. But the emperor, probably with an exasperated sigh, wrote to him, knowing full well that this council organized of the local clergy and the clearly biased cleric that he had just sent down was just another excuse to beat on the Arians, and suggested that they make it a truly universal council, inviting representatives from every district in the empire to come together and finally hammer out once and for all these squabbles that they'd been having,
figure it
so
out,
that he
man.
could get back to emperoring and spend some time founding a new capital in his own name. So join us next time as we dive into the Council of Nicaea. Perhaps
Okay, yeah, I have learned about the Council of Nicaea. That did come up, and I don't know what the course was. I think it was just a Roman history course I took. It sounds incredibly interesting. Everybody kind of gathering around, like, okay, can we just standardize this stuff already? As we know now, it might have helped for a time. I'm not sure exactly, but you can only prevent these schisms from occurring for so long, and perhaps trying to. It seems like there's really no winning. If you try to brutally oppress a group, they dig their heels in. If you try to find commonality with everybody, everybody will dig their heels in, and that's just where we end up, in a place where people are just not willing to budge, and whether they're being bolstered by oppression, and whether or not that justifies their cause or whatever. I don't know if there's any way I could go back and be like, okay, I'm gonna go back in time and fix the church and keep it all in one piece for all coming time. I don't think there's any way of doing that with all the hindsight in the world.
the most famous church council of all time. Will they solve the problems of the Christian church? Will they
will
end
not.
the schisms once and for all?
Nope. Let's continue.
Last we left off, Constantine had just called together a council of Christian bishops from around the known world. They were to resolve all the challenges of the church so that he, Constantine, could get back to uniting the empire under Christianity. The council was set to tackle issues ranging from what day to celebrate Easter to how to heal the Meletian Schism, a sect like the Donatists who were concerned with the readmittance of lapsed priests into the church. This council was also going to formalize how the liturgy was given, provide rules for the structure of the church, and set down some guidelines for being a priest. No living in the houses of young women, no self-castration, no engaging in usury, that sort of thing. But above all, they were there to deal with one thing: the Arian heresy. This was the main topic, the front and center issue that everybody had come to discuss. It was tearing apart the Christian world, and it was time it came to an end. So 318 bishops assembled in one late spring, 325 CE, in the coastal Anatolian town of Nicaea to settle this once and for all. The conference center was arrayed in splendor by the emperor. The bishops and all their aides and advisors were guests of the empire, housed, fed, and cared for at imperial expense. But more than that, the emperor himself would be in attendance. That's just how important this was to Constantine. Constantine set the tone for the meeting, walking in not surrounded by guards, as was the norm for the person of the emperor, but rather entering surrounded only by a few friends. This wasn't a battle, it was a time to come together. And so it began. The debate was vigorous, using all the rhetorical art the Roman world was famous for. Laity and clerics both engaged in arguing the merits of each side, while the emperor sat there, gently reminding everyone that they were all Christians here, and that they needn't treat each other like enemies of the faith. And for weeks the discussions went on, contentious, impassioned, on at least one occasion breaking out into a brawl.
That's interesting. Sorry, bud. I got one of his pin feathers and he got pissed. That's kind of fascinating. Seeing the emperor really take just kind of an overseer's role. It's got to take a certain degree of humility to put yourself in that, to go from emperor to put yourself in that position. Sorry. I'm starting to lose my voice. We might have to cut this after the Lost World watch along. I only think I'm gonna have so much more when we're done with extra history. It's kind of impressive, the idea of an emperor just overseeing things and just kind of keeping things in control. A more self-important person might really try to throw their weight around in a meeting like this. Many other leaders probably would. So it does say something about his character. I don't know how confident he is in his knowledge of scripture. One would not want to expose themselves as being ignorant of any of that sort of stuff. So I don't know if maybe he'd just rather observe and play sort of a facilitator and try to like gently push things in whatever direction. It's very interesting.
But for all this, the truth was that most of the bishops were relatively moderate, looking to come to the correct answer, but believing that an answer could be found that both sides could agree to. And the emperor himself was happy to embrace anything that would just get all these guys to agree. So the discussions really resolved down to the points of view of two men. Arius, the namesake of Arianism, whose unbending views had caused the council to be summoned in the first place, and a man named Athanasius. Athanasius was a deacon of Alexandria, where the whole Arian schism began. He was an ardent anti-Arian, and he intended to do everything in his power to make sure that no compromise with the Arians was reached. And so time rolled forward with the council split, no overwhelming majority willing to come down on either side. Debate continued on how to achieve a compromise position, but the discussion wound in circles as these two men, Athanasius and Arius, dominated the discussion and kept any chance of truly finding a middle ground at bay. Still, time and again, the emperor reminded them all that they were here to heal the church, that as Romans and as Christians, they were more alike than different, and that they should be able to find a way to work such esoteric theological differences out. But Constantine, powerful...
Like, I don't know a ton about Constantine, but honestly, this is making him look like it smelled like roses, not look like roses. He's wearing red here, but he's smelling like roses coming out of this one. It's not bad.
Intelligent and adroit as he was not the type of subtle theologian that Athanasius turned out to be. Because as the debate moved on, Athanasius began to introduce the term homoousian into the discussion. And this was a throw of the dice, because homoousian means of the same substance, which made many of the bishops a little uneasy, as it had been used in other heretical contexts before to claim that there was no difference between God the Son and God the Father. But Athanasius knew that this was a term that Arius had objected to in the past, and that he would never agree to any compromise that involved using the term homoousian. So Athanasius started to appear to be the reasonable one. He could look as if he were slightly willing to bend, knowing that no compromise he ever offered would be accepted so long as it could be worded talking about...
Oh, he's doing he's doing the metagame here. He's trying to make this guy look like a butthole. Dude, I said butthole.
Christ as homoousian. And here's where the debate really began to get rowdy, because now people had to polarize. You had to agree with this term or not, as no one was going to compromise around it. There was one last attempt at bringing everyone together, though, trying to get people to meet in the middle and say that Christ was homoiousian, or of similar nature to God. But by now, this was thoroughly rejected by all those who had declared themselves firmly on one side or another. And even as this compromise was being discussed, Athanasius was secretly pulling people over to his side. While the great debate was happening in public, the anti-Arian faction was making deals and persuading people in private. Slowly, bishop by bishop, they assembled a majority coalition. And soon, that majority was threatening damnation and excommunication for anybody who followed the heretical Arian formulation. And so, those less firm in their Arian beliefs began to switch sides as well. Not wanting to risk their immortal souls, or perhaps their positions in the church, almost every delegate signed on to the homoousian idea of Christ. Only Arius himself, one deacon, and two other bishops refused to sign what would become known as the Nicene Creed, cementing the Trinitarian view of Christ. And thus, Arianism was declared heresy, its teachings anathema, and its preaching an exilable offense.
So Arianism is really one of the big precursors to, like, any sort of, I'm not going to say Protestantism, because that's very much something of its time, but something in that general spirit, something that really does go against the establishment. And I love me a rebel or whatever. And this guy, the other guy, not this guy, the other guy was clearly being a sneaky bastard about the whole thing. So, but I also don't really care for that hard-headedness. But, like, I also respect when somebody really fights for their beliefs. So, I don't know. I don't expect to relate to these guys that well.
So the emperor got up, dusted off his chlamys, and thought to himself, job well done. I mean, after all, he had brought all the priests together, they had basically all agreed on something, and he could now exile those few who had disagreed, unity would be restored, and he could get back to ruling the empire. But it's not quite that simple, because a few months later, Constantine found he also had to exile a man named Eusebius, a prelate who had signed the creed but who continued to refuse to condemn Arius. This may seem like a small thing, one man being exiled over taking a half-hearted stand not condemning his friend, but Eusebius was actually a distant relative of Constantine's, and unlike Arius, who was principally known in Egypt and the ecclesiastical circles of the East, Eusebius was a member of Constantine's court. In fact, that's why he had to exile him, because he kept pushing for Arius in Constantine's inner circle long after Constantine was good and done with this whole heresy thing. But
I mean, banishing somebody in your own court, that's a great way to sow discomfort in the others who are left behind.
Constantine's sister...
I assume that's what they're going for with this. Like, getting rid of him makes those who are left behind think, oh, this might not be working out. It creates, like, a sense of doubt.
Liked Eusebius, and soon he was recalled from exile. But if there was any doubt which side Eusebius was on, his exile cemented him as a firm Arian. And so he worked at court day by day to soften the emperor's views on Arianism. And, as even exiling its principal supporters and declaring the belief heretical hadn't actually stamped out the Arian beliefs, Constantine began to be receptive to the idea of a softer rapprochement than he had previously been, a kind of coexistence. After all, he wanted harmony in his empire. But harmony was not on Eusebius's mind. He schemed against Athanasius, never publicly putting himself in opposition to him, but getting other groups to accuse Athanasius of a myriad of crimes. At last, through a rigged trial, he was able to get Athanasius convicted, and he convinced the emperor that it was actually Athanasius who was now preventing the rift in the Christian church to heal, with his die-hard refusal to readmit schismatics into the church, and that he should be exiled. Meanwhile, Eusebius had also succeeded in getting Arius recalled. So with Athanasius exiled and Arius recalled, the...
Fun fact, at the Council of Nicaea, Santa, aka Saint Nicholas, punched Arius in the face. How could they... Michael Hill, that is probably one of the best fun facts that I've ever received. And I'm imagining him as Santa Claus in this image. And the fact that that's not mentioned, they must have just not known that he was involved in that, well, that he did that in that particular skirmish. Because, like, anybody who knows that fact would bring that up, you would assume. They might not have known specifically whose fist hit whose face, or maybe that's in the Lies episode. Who knows? Maybe they'll mention that. But that's freaking hilarious. That is just, like, stupid.
The Arian doctrine began to gain strength in the empire again. Constantine himself would, at the very end of his life, be baptized by Eusebius. And his son? His son would be a die-hard Arian throughout his rule. And though after hundreds of years the Nicene Creed would eventually win out, this reprieve for Arianism allowed it to spread and slip out of the empire. For Eusebius ordained a Goth named Ulphilas to go on a mission to the Gothic tribes, and he was successful, converting many and cementing Arian Christianity as the Christianity of the northern tribes. And this is one of the reasons that the Gothic tribes never really integrated into the Roman Empire. It's one of the reasons that rather than become assimilated like so many other groups, they remained separate, integral to the empire but never really being part of it. And in the end, it's part of why they tore the empire apart. Join us next time as we jump a few hundred years ahead for the Monophysite heresy, which plagued Justinian and destroyed the unity of Eastern Rome.
Yay, we get to return to our friend Justinian. Remember that guy? We spent a long time on his series. How many episodes were there? I think it was like... What was it? I think it was like 10, 12? It's like 12 episodes? Jeez. And he gets a cameo or something in this next one? That's stupid. Justinian's getting so much love and attention. Maybe not necessarily love, but attention. All attention's good attention, I suppose. That's not even true. That's not even true. The publicity thing does not work here. All right, so we have one more. We're gonna be wrapping this up pretty soon, and then shortly after that, we'll chat for a little bit, and then we will be watching The Lost World, which is some stupid stuff. And after this, also, I do want to talk for a second about the upcoming post show. After we're done here, I'm going to be doing some stuff for the members, and I'm going to talk to you guys about what you're going to be seeing if you decide you want to become a channel member. If you're interested, it's there if you want. If it's not, you don't even trip about it. So let's get started with this one. This is a big jump here. This is I like that this is in like kind of compilation style. It's more thematic than it is chronological. So I like how it's going. Hey, Ethan Benoit, welcome back.
Jump forward with us 125 years from the Council of Nicaea to the last days of the Western Roman Empire. Gaul, Hispania, much of North Africa have all been lost. Arian barbarians control nearly all of the Western Roman world. Britannia had long ago been abandoned. The Huns have smashed into the empire, sapping its remaining strength. But there was still the East, with its rich provinces of Anatolia and Egypt to support the empire. If the East would just step in, perhaps Rome could be put back together as it had under the reign of Aurelian. But the East was in the middle of a religious dispute. Now, that wasn't the only reason this didn't happen, of course. At this point, the East and the West had in some ways become closer to rivals than to coordinated parts of the empire, and the Huns, although not causing as much damage as in the West, had extracted unimaginable tribute from the Eastern Empire. But for all that, it certainly didn't make it any more likely that the East would step in when, in the middle of this crisis, the Emperor Theodosius II found himself mired in a religious schism. And here's where it gets really complex. All that esoteric and minor doctrinal stuff we talked about in the previous episodes, that's just a warm-up for what's coming now, so get ready. So there's this monk, Nestorius, and he's chummy with the Emperor. He gets tapped to be the Patriarch of Constantinople, just about the biggest deal you can be in the Christian world at the time, with Rome itself still barely part of the empire. But he gets caught up in a local debate over the nature of Christ and starts espousing that Christ has two separate natures, one divine and one human. We'll call this Nestorianism. This, of course, causes a huge flameout with the folks that we'll call, for reasons that will become obvious in a moment, the Chalcedonians, as they believe that Christ had two perfectly unified natures, one divine and one human, which of course caused a huge blow-up with the guys that we'll call the monophysites, who believed that Christ was entirely of one nature, divine and human. I know what you're thinking. If anything, this all makes too much sense. But just in case a few of you got lost in how much sense that just made, I'll dive into a little more detail. That really is the basic split, though. Does Christ have two separate natures, two unified natures, or one nature that sort of encompassed what everybody else called two?
So now we're kind of getting to the point where, like, it's such... These feel so vaguely different. Like, they're not as different as a lot of the earlier disagreements were. It feels like they're fighting over like the placement of a comma. It's really, really like subtle at this point, the differences here. And I'm sure if you're like into theology, it seems very clear to you. But this does not seem like, to a layman, to have like nearly as much like going for it. I don't know. All right,
two natures. And that may seem really trivial, but to people of the day, it was more than a simple matter of life and death. It was a matter of eternal life or eternal damnation. So this is really, really important to a lot of people, but it also gets wrapped up with church politics, regional disputes, and imperial authority. Because this guy, Cyril of Alexandria, starts calling Nestorius' teachings heretical. But the clergy in Constantinople are all basically like, hey, who are you from faraway Alexandria to be telling us what to do? So Cyril actually reaches out to the Pope in Rome and asks him for a judgment, who in turn basically says, Cyril, go excommunicate this guy if he doesn't change his mind in like 10 days. So Nestorius turns to his buddy, Theodosius II, and says, let's call a council and figure this out. And by figure this out, I mean let's excommunicate Cyril. But before the council even gets called, Cyril stands up and is basically like, you can't excommunicate me, I excommunicate you! And now it's on. The council is called, and Cyril tries to ninja his way into being the guy running the council, basically by saying, I'm the guy running this council. At first, this doesn't work, but several of the delegations are delayed, and this gives Cyril time to prod some of the undecided bishops until he has a majority. And so he just declares the council started, and himself in charge. Nestorius is, of course, having none of this, doesn't acknowledge Cyril, and refuses to accept that the council can begin before the delegation from Antioch arrives, which it hasn't yet. The bishops who back Nestorius all show up to the place where the council's being held to protest, and things start to get rowdy. At this point, the emperor's representative steps in and asks Cyril to just wait for 4 more days to see if the Antiochians arrive. which is when Cyril really steps up his ninja game and basically tricks the Emperor's representative into reading the Emperor's decree, which ends with an offhand line about how he wants them to, quote, start the council without delay and bring unity back to the church quickly. But an offhand line by the Emperor is still an order by the Emperor, and so with that imperial decree read aloud to what was effectively a quorum, because the protesting bishops who supported Nestorius were there in the hall, legally, for both the church and the state, the council had now started. And of course that council promptly held up the excommunication of Nestorius. But then the delegation from Antioch finally arrives, and miffed that Cyril had started the thing without them, forms their own council and excommunicates Cyril. So Cyril's council excommunicates the Antiochians, and now that everybody's excommunicated everybody else, everybody has to get word to the emperor, who's back in Constantinople, about who has been excommunicated. But the Nestorians have more friends at court, and they divert all of Cyril's messages, until Cyril's faction sends...
Fun fact, we got a fun fact from Thomas Sugg. I love whenever we get some. Fun fact, the first Archbishop of Canterbury was an Italian named Augustine. He was sent to England in 597 to convert the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. He succeeded in converting the King of Kent in around 600. Oh, that's pretty cool. Antioch, home of superior weaponry. Ooh, that sounds like fun. I don't think we're going to be getting any of that, but that sounds very interesting. I don't know. We still got 5 minutes. 5 minutes. 3 minutes. You think that's time for a war?
Sends a man dressed as a beggar with a message hidden in a hollowed-out cane to secret his message through. So the emperor gets the news and banishes Nestorius, which clearly that resolves everything. Everyone would meekly give up, agree to get along, and all splits in the church would be healed forever. And yet, shockingly, everybody just kept excommunicating each other. The emperor called a second council to determine which of...
I'm not deposed. You're deposed. Wait, you can't depose me. You're deposed. We were just here, is the point.
These excommunications were really
Some
legal,
things never
but
change.
This council was a mess too. Famously known as the Robbers' Council, as it was convened with no time for any of the representatives from the West to get there, and so it was run almost entirely by monophysites from the East. They proceed to excommunicate and condemn everybody even remotely connected with Nestorius. And then they went even further and basically declared that the only correct way to see Christ was as having one nature. And of course, this sets off everybody. The Pope was livid. The bishops that were excluded were furious. And it goes without saying that those who got excommunicated or condemned without having any say in the matter were a little put out as well. So the church starts to tear itself apart over this. And in the midst of all of it, Theodosius II croaks. So the new emperor, Marcian, calls a third council to try to unravel the...
I say it's fun. Another case of me using the word fun in the wrong context again. I've done this way too many times. It's not fun that he just, like, upped and died. I'm not saying that. That sounds like I'm saying, good, I'm glad you're dead. More like, ooh, let's see what happens. Finger pyramid of evil contemplation.
This and figure out if any of it was legal at all. So, this time, the bishops all come together at a place called Chalcedon. All of the things the Second Council had said were basically immediately overturned. A bunch of the folks who had supported the Second Council were demoted or excommunicated, and the Chalcedonian Creed, or the idea that Christ was two perfectly combined natures, was adapted as official canon of the Church. Okay, so surely now everything would be settled, right? Wrong again! See, this is right about where the Coptic, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Syriac, and Armenian Apostolic and Malankara churches split from what would now be called the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, although at the time they were really one thing. Remember in the Justinian and Theodora episodes how Justinian kept trying to bring the church back together? This is the split he would later be trying to heal. And remember how Justinian was Orthodox and Theodora was Monophysite? Again, that's a big deal because this council, the Council of Chalcedon, split the whole Christian world down those lines. And this division would rip the Byzantine world apart for centuries. It would take on political dimensions as well as religious ones, as one easy way to oppose the emperor was always to stir up whatever religious faction he wasn't a part of. This split would also make it easier for other groups to break the more Monophysite-leaning regions off from the empire as it started to decline. Who knows how history would have turned out without these schisms, heresies, and disputes? Would it have saved Rome, or would it have just left Europe even more fragmented without those hard-fought ideas to bind it together?
Sorry, it's birds having snack time right now. Yeah, I love the kind of what ifs about like every single Christian schism. I've been asked many times, like, who do you think is the most important historical figure of all time? And I always opt for like, well, some people will say like he's not a historical figure and he may not have actually existed, but like I'll say like Jesus, probably, right? It would have to be Jesus. Like, even as a non-religious person, I understand like how important, even if he, even if the people who say like he was not actually a person and like maybe he was based on a bunch of people or something else. Uh, Plenty of people do believe in a historical Jesus, though, and even if he wasn't real, just the idea of him has created so much division, has created uh so many civilizations that like built themselves up, uh kind of using that as kind of cultural scaffolding to create what they ended up being. So I still stand by that like Jesus, or the idea of Jesus, is like the most important historical figure of all time, at least in human history. I cannot think of anybody who even comes close to rivaling that. There's some really important political figures that, as we get into the modern age, but I don't know if we could ever argue that they have as much of a lasting impact. I mean, I think it's an impossible argument that it's airtight. Jesus.
We do know is that all this thought and all this effort helped to shape the late classical and early medieval period. For better or worse, these esoteric disputes played a huge part in the transition from the ancient world to the medieval one. So thank you for bearing with us as we wound our way through all that esoterica. These names, Arianism,
Esoterica indeed.
Monophysites, Chalcedonians, they're gonna come up again and again as we discuss this period of history, and there's no way we could give a complete picture of this era without them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Dude, that was stupid fun. That was really fun. Oh my god. I'm getting tired, man. Streaming's hard. Like, sitting here and doing nothing feels like it should be the easiest thing in the world, but honestly, like, staying engaged, I respect those who do these like daily, all day streams. It's really impressive what people do. The fact that they can keep an audience engaged for so long, like, I truly am impressed with them at this stage. So that was a really fun, a really fun series. So I'm gonna try to normalize doing extra history on here, like once a week or once every other week. Maybe I'll do an extra history series on here. I might go back and forth between them and Geography Now. Like, I'll do a handful of Geography Nows, or I'll do a full extra history series every single week. Just kind of try to normalize that stuff.